We talk endlessly about boomers, millennials, and Gen Z. It's a nonstop, 24-hour news cycle of cultural dissection, a world defined by clicks, likes, and shares, an entire economy built on a relentless, desperate search for one thing: validation. We measure our lives in follower counts and our moments in the currency of engagement. We've become the product, performing for an algorithm that promises connection, but often just delivers comparison and anxiety. But what if I told you there's another story? A story about the generation that was pivotal in building this machine, but largely refuses to be its product. There's a generation that came of age between the analog and digital worlds, a group that understands the internet's code because they helped write it, and yet, for the most part, has a deeply skeptical relationship with it. Sandwiched in the middle, almost invisible in the cultural conversation, is an entire generation that was raised without applause. They came home to an empty house with a key on a shoelace around their neck and learned a different lesson entirely. Their psychology is one of the most misunderstood of any alive today, and it holds a key to understanding our very human need for approval in a world engineered to addict us to it. This is a story of Generation X, and why their skepticism might just be the survival skill we've all forgotten. To understand Gen X, you have to go back. Back before smartphones, before the internet, before the idea that your life was a performance to be documented. You have to go back to the sound of a key turning in a lock and the profound quiet of an empty house. This was the era of the Latchkey kid. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, this generation grew up during a period of immense social and economic change. Divorce rates were climbing, and for the first time, dual income households became a necessity for many. The result was that by the mid 1980s, estimates suggested that millions of children were regularly left unsupervised after school. This wasn't some niche experience. For millions, it was just Tuesday. They weren't just coming home to an empty house, they were coming home to a world with far less adult supervision. Psychologically, this common experience had a staggering impact. It created what some researchers call a high contingency environment, where your actions and their outcomes were directly and often painfully linked. If you forgot your homework, there was no parent to text for a photo of the assignment. If you broke something, you either figured out how to fix it or faced the music when your parents got home. If you got into a fight with a friend, you had to navigate the messy, uncurated reality of human conflict on your own. There was no audience for your struggles and no applause for your small victories. Validation wasn't a like or a comment. It was the quiet, internal satisfaction of a problem solved. It was a bike chain, slick with grease, finally clicking back into place. It was a meal, improvised from whatever was in the fridge, that filled your stomach. It was a scraped knee, cleaned and bandaged by your own hands. This environment forged a deep self-reliance. It wasn't a philosophy they were taught. It was a survival strategy absorbed in the quiet hours of an empty afternoon. They learned to be alone without being lonely. They developed rich interior lives because often their own imagination was the only entertainment available. When you spend your formative years learning that the only person you can truly count on to show up is yourself, it fundamentally wires your brain to look inward for approval, not outward. This wasn't a choice, it was a necessity, and it created a psychological blueprint that stands in stark, almost defiant contrast to the world we live in today. This radical self-reliance naturally gave birth to another core Gen X trait, a profound and unshakable skepticism. They were promised stability but saw their parents, the company man generation, get hit with mass layoffs. They were told to trust institutions but grew up in the shadow of Watergate and the Cold War, learning early that the official story was rarely the whole story. This isn't the performative cynicism you might see online. It's a deeper, more pragmatic mindset that some psychologists call defensive pessimism. It's not that Gen X believes things will go wrong, but they operate from the conclusion that they could, because history has shown them it often does. So, you hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. That famous Gen X mantra, whatever, isn't apathy. It's a suit of armor against the shock of disappointment. It's an emotional, self-preservation strategy learned from watching the systems you were told to believe in fail. This skepticism is precisely why Gen X has such a complicated relationship with social media. They are the bridge generation. They remember life before the internet, but were also central figures in its commercial explosion. They are old enough to have experienced a world without it and therefore see it not as a given, but as a tool. And like any tool, they question its cost. While younger generations were digital natives growing up inside the social media ecosystem, Gen X were digital immigrants. They came to it as adults with fully formed identities and that trademark skepticism. They watched as the like button was invented, and their life experience outside of that system made them more likely to question the manipulation mechanism at play. They saw the variable reward loop, the same neurological trick used in slot machines, for what it was, a system designed to grab and hold your attention. They saw highlight reels creating unrealistic benchmarks for life and watched friendships implode over a misread tweet. And because their impulse control was already developed, many were able to look at the entire apparatus and say, no, thank you. For Gen X, privacy isn't just a setting you toggle, it's a survival mechanism you learn. They were raised on stranger danger, the idea that you don't share personal information with people you don't know. So the modern impulse to broadcast every thought, meal, and vulnerability to thousands of algorithmic strangers strikes many of them as not just foolish, but dangerous. In the Gen X worldview, being visible means being vulnerable, and exposure is risk. To fully grasp the Gen X mindset, we have to understand the machine they've often chosen to opt out of. We need to look at the psychological architecture of the social media validation trap. Our brains are wired for social connection. For our ancestors, acceptance by the tribe meant safety. Rejection could mean death. Our brains developed a powerful reward system to encourage pro-social behavior. When we experience positive social interaction, our brain's reward pathways are activated, reinforcing the behavior that led to it. It signals to our brain, that was good, do it again. For millennia, this system worked just fine. Social feedback was slow, nuanced, and came from a small, trusted community. But social media platforms have hacked this ancient system. A like, a share, a follow, these are quantified, immediate, and public bursts of social approval. They create what's known as a variable reward loop, delivering an unpredictable stream of social feedback that can condition users to check their feeds repeatedly. The problem is, the brain adapts. Over time, we can become desensitized, needing more and more external validation to get the same good feeling. What's worse is the crash. When the likes don't come, or when they're fewer than expected, it can feel like social rejection. This is the validation loop, a cycle of seeking, reward, and reinforcement that keeps users craving more, and it's particularly potent for younger brains. A long-term study from the University of North Carolina found that teens who habitually check social media become increasingly hypersensitive to feedback from their peers. Their brains show more activity in regions associated with anticipating social rewards and punishments. Another computational study analyzing over 1.6 million Instagram posts confirmed it. Adolescents are more sensitive to social feedback than adults, and their mood is affected more strongly when they get fewer likes than expected. This is where a catastrophic shift from internal to external validation can happen. Likes and follower counts become proxies for social worth. Your identity becomes conditional. I am valuable if my post gets 100 likes. This creates a fragile sense of self-worth that rises and falls with the whims of an algorithm. A key 2014 study by Vogel and colleagues found a link between Facebook use and lower self-esteem. That relationship was explained or mediated by greater exposure to upward social comparisons, constantly comparing your real, messy life to someone else's curated highlight reel. It's a game you can never win. This is the machine. And a lot of Gen Xers, having built their sense of self on a different foundation, largely refuse to play. Many will tell you straight up, I already know who I am. I don't need 500 strangers to confirm it. When you're not chasing validation, the machine's power over you simply dissolves. If there's one stereotype about the Gen X work ethic that rings true, it's their obsession with competence. They were mislabeled as slackers in their youth, but the reality is they're obsessed with work, just not in the way other generations are. They don't have the blind loyalty of their boomer parents, and they often lack the purpose-driven language of millennials. For many in Gen X, it boils down to one thing: competence. Their first jobs weren't prestigious internships, they were paper routes at dawn and fast food shifts where you had to make change in your head. Having watched the corporate ladder collapse for their parents, they never bought into company loyalty. Their survival strategy was different. They couldn't control the economy, but they could control their own value. Their career philosophy often became about being quietly, undeniably indispensable. This creates a complicated relationship with authority. Gen X tends to respect competence, not titles. If a leader has earned their stripes and knows what they're doing, they'll follow them to the ends of the earth. But if a boss is all talk, they'll quietly dismiss them and simply work around them. They learn to manage themselves, so they have little patience for being micromanaged. Give them a task, leave them alone, and they'll often produce their best work. This leads to a fascinating paradox. They are fiercely independent, but also quietly collaborative. The independence is easy to see. Asking for help can feel like a personal failure, a betrayal of the latchkey kid ethos to figure it out yourself. A Gen Xer might spend 6 hours wrestling with a simple repair before calling a professional, not to save money, but because they believe they should be able to handle it. But here's the other side. While they may not ask for help, they are often the first to show up, without drama or fanfare, when you need it. If your car breaks down, they just appear. If there's a crisis at work, they're the ones silently arranging logistics in the background. There will be no long post about their good deed. They just do it and move on. This comes from learning to rely on your peers when the adults were absent. You handle your own business, but you always show up for your people. It would be easy to glorify Gen X as the stoic, resilient heroes of the modern age, but that would be an incomplete picture. The same upbringing that forged their strength also left some scars. The figure it out yourself mantra, while building resilience, also built walls. Research suggests that Gen X tends to favor pragmatic, problem solving approaches to stress, often preferring to manage challenges independently. This stoicism can sometimes curdle into isolation. Studies have noted that, raised to handle problems quietly, Gen X can be less likely to seek out mental health care than younger generations. The emotional self sufficiency they learned as children can become emotional inaccessibility as adults. Many learn to manage their feelings by silencing them, a habit that can be incredibly difficult to unlearn. Here, we see the stark contrast with younger generations. Millennials and Gen Z are often far more willing to seek out social support and share their vulnerabilities, a behavior that builds community and reduces the stigma around mental health. While this can sometimes risk a reliance on external validation for emotional regulation, their openness is a strength Gen X could learn from. The goal isn't to declare one generation's psychology superior. Each is an adaptation to a wildly different world. Gen X was adapted to a world where exposure was a risk and a low profile was a survival skill. Millennials and Gen Z are adapted to a world where visibility can be power and sharing is a way of connecting. The tragedy is not that younger generations seek validation. That's a deeply human need. The tragedy is that the platforms they use are designed to exploit that need in a way that can be profoundly damaging. So what's the lesson? The path forward seems to be a hybrid, to cultivate the internal resilience of Gen X without succumbing to their isolation, and to embrace the emotional openness of younger generations without becoming dependent on external metrics for your self-worth. It's about learning to decouple your identity from the algorithm, to recognize that likes are a measure of engagement, not a measure of your value. It's about reclaiming the low profile, practicing privacy, and understanding that not everything needs to be shared. And it's about deliberately seeking validation from tangible, real-world achievements. A skill mastered, a project completed, a relationship nurtured, rather than from the flickering scoreboard of a screen. Be strong enough to handle a crisis alone, but wise enough to know you don't have to. Generation X is the bridge. They stand with one foot in the analog world and the other in the digital one. They are the translators between the old and the new, quietly holding things together. They were raised without applause, and as a result, they never learned to need it. Their legacy won't be found in viral posts or loud manifestos. It's in the stable systems they maintained, the problems they solve before anyone else notices, and the quiet competence that forms the backbone of so much of our world. And perhaps the most Gen X thing of all is that they don't really care if you notice. In a world that screams for our attention, their quiet confidence offers a radical alternative. It suggests that the most confident people aren't the ones with the most followers. They are the ones who don't need an audience to know they exist. So I'll leave you with this. What would your life look like if you stopped chasing validation and started building it from within? If this message resonated with you, if you felt seen in this story, whether you're a Gen Xer or just trying to understand one, let us know in the comments. What is your Gen X experience with validation? And if you want to keep exploring the hidden psychology that shapes our world, consider subscribing. We appreciate you being here